The Danish thinker and mystic Martinus, 1890 to 1991, presented a comprehensive metaphysical system that explores and explains a wide range of topics, from the nature of consciousness and reality to an objective ethics and the structure of a just and fair society. Although a mystic, his argumentative justification for this system is not based on transcendent experiences, but instead on rational arguments and methods. It is thus broadly philosophical, and it is of interest to examine his views further, not least given their unconventional nature, to provide fresh perspectives on the complex problems faced by contemporary philosophy. In a prior video, I presented a brief introductory overview of some key elements in Martinus' metaphysics. In this video, I will give some of these elements a more in-depth treatment, focusing on the philosophical value of Martinus' metaphysical system. While topics concerning mystical experiences are being discussed philosophically, it is quite uncommon to incorporate ideas from the mystical tradition into modern professional philosophical thinking, at least in the sense of incorporating mystics' metaphysical claims themselves in a serious way as constructive input for philosophical debates. But interesting exceptions demonstrate that such involvement can lead to new perspectives and solutions to current philosophical problems, not least the particularly difficult mind-body problem, the relationship between the physical and the mental. One approach to incorporating the mystical tradition into the philosophical debate is to include concrete first-person descriptions of mystical experiences. This approach is not an uncontroversial one in contemporary philosophy, though. Possible objections to this approach include a rejection of a claim that there is sufficient coincidence between the various reports of the mystics, not least due to the esoteric or theistic language used by mystics, and the claim that pure unmediated experiences, as mystics are contended to have, are not possible at all. Another approach is to embrace the teachings of a specific mystic directly. A possible objection here would be that mystical experiences do not provide adequate philosophical justification for such teachings, though. A third approach, which seems to avoid these objections, is also possible. Instead of an empirical approach where the mystics' experiences are held to provide argumentative support for the position advocated, the basis for justification can be constituted in the rational epistemological method, broadly understood. This, however, requires that a broadly rational rather than transcendent and empirical justification for a worldview along the lines of the one described by mystics can be found. This is precisely the case with the Danish mystic Martinus. An epistemology based primarily on mystical experience is arguably located outside of established philosophical methods. Arguments can be made supporting such an approach, but everything else being equal, it seems quite controversial. Martinus, however, differs from at least some mystics by justifying his metaphysics not primarily through reference to transcendent or mystical experiences, but instead through rational arguments. While he admits that the source of his insights is indeed mystical experience, he nevertheless insists that his worldview is logically structured and consequently can be justified through rational thought. The presentation of it, he emphasizes, quote, is not in any instance based on unsubstantiated claims, but strictly expresses coherent logical conclusions that can be examined and verified by the genuine intellectual and impartial reader or seeker of truth. End quote. This approach seems to be much closer to established traditional methods within philosophy than a reference to mystical experience. Martinus' system of thought has received minimal professional philosophical treatment thus far, making it of further interest to examine his thinking, given the stance that it is worth applying new and fresh perspectives to difficult and unsolved philosophical problems. Martinus' work, described as, quote, a vast textual corpus, end quote, includes more than 40 books and numerous articles and manuscripts. His metaphysical system is comprehensive, treating and explaining numerous and varied subjects and phenomena, often in relatively fine detail, while at the same time being metaphysics on a grand scale. The overarching theme is the fundamental nature of reality, but it is treated not just at an abstracted general level, but also in terms of the concrete conditions of human existence. In addition to such metaphysical issues as the nature of reality, the nature of consciousness, free will, etc., subjects such as objective ethics, historical and future societal, economic and political development, psychological stages, health and disease, and traditional religions are also addressed, all from a metaphysical foundation. New and, in several cases, seemingly quite novel perspectives on a wide variety of topics are thus to be found in his writings. Overall, many factors tell in favor of taking a closer look at Martinus' metaphysical system. As mentioned, I've given an introductory overview of some of the key aspects of his metaphysics in a prior video. I will do a somewhat more in-depth presentation of some relevant elements here. According to Martinus, ultimately, the only thing that can be said about reality is that it is, quote, something that is, end quote. As soon as we want a more detailed explanation, we move into the world of description and theoretical models. Every description and every concept must necessarily be rooted in our world of experience in the broadest sense. And to the extent that the fundamental nature of reality lies outside this world, it thus becomes a theoretical rather than a self-perceived understanding, with all the limitations that this entails. In concordance with the mystical tradition, Martinus argues that everything is fundamentally one, a single entity. However, when it comes to the theoretical descriptions, he presents a Triunic view. The living being can be conceived as consisting of three components. One, the substantial and eternal core, that which experiences, termed the I, as in I am, or X1. X, since at the most fundamental level it is simply something that is. 2, a metaphysical structure that allows for interaction and experience as such, termed the faculty for sensing or creating, or X2. And 3, the phenomenal world, that which is experienced, termed matter, or X3. Thus, the living being consists of something that experiences, something that allows for experience, and something that is experienced. According to Martinus, this is the minimally or most metaphysically parsimonious requirement for the existence of the experiencing subject. Our whole world of experience is made up of the manifestation, X3, of innumerable I's, X1, not only in terms of physical phenomena, but also when it comes to our inner world of thoughts and feelings. Every single experience is thus comprised of manifestations or appearances of the I's behind it. Experience per se is thus the interaction of the I with other I's. Thus, the metaphysics of Martinus can be interpreted as one of absolute idealism, in the sense that the noumenal, substantively existing world, x1, is experienced as a world of appearance, x3. While everything is basically one, due to the faculty of sensing or creating, x2, we experience things as being discrete, including ourselves as individuals. This triunic structure is immutable and thus eternal. Change, including creation and destruction, belongs to the sphere of experience, x3. Consequently, the individual living being possesses eternal existence. In Martinus' view, each subject is on a never-ending journey through different stages of existence to ever new experiences. That is what life fundamentally is. While that which experiences, x1, does not change, the effects of all of the experiences are stored, so to speak, in x2. As the characteristics and traits of the individual are a function of what is stored in x2, the living being is in a continuous and never-ending process of evolution and personal existential development. This development occurs cyclically over immeasurable epochs through 6 major stages or planes of existence, kingdoms, of which we are familiar with the mineral, the plant, and the animal kingdoms, with the next stage in our current development being the real human kingdom. A living being reincarnates and goes through thousands, he says, of individual lives in each of the 6 kingdoms before gradually moving to the next kingdom. A primary driving force in this evolutionary process is that the experiences caused by the pain and suffering of the individual through the many incarnations lead to that individual's empathy and understanding for other beings suffering slowly increasing. This causes the rise of an increasingly more altruistic ethics and loving way of behaving toward all living beings. The human being, though, is currently, as he phrases it, a wounded refugee between 2 kingdoms. We are no longer animals in the purest sense, but neither are we fully developed humans, not least due to ethical shortcomings. While there are significant individual differences, most people struggle between expressing egoistic and altruistic behavior, and this represents an inner transformation. The very presence of conscience, of basic narratives of good versus evil, the concept of the ought of ethics, are due to humankind currently finding itself in this transitory phase. This is not an evolution towards simply emotional or unreflective compassion, but rather this ethical and emotional progress is combined with increased insight and wisdom, leading to intellectualized feeling, by which Martinus means an all-encompassing love rooted in a deep understanding of the true nature of reality. In addition to the ethically oriented development, other basic characteristics slowly change as well, including psychological and even biological ones. For example, the human being's psyche slowly changes from the ability to accept claims or demands grounded solely in authority to requiring a logical explanation in order to accept a given claim. The person loses religious belief for a time, focusing instead purely on the materialistic aspects of the world, but eventually ends up with a more spiritual, but still rational and holistic understanding of reality. So a personal focus on ethics and altruism is one of the most important goals of a human being, according to Martinus, if not the ultimate goal. One major reason for presenting his world picture, his metaphysical system, is, he says, to provide a logical or rational basis for a worldview that meets and intellectually justifies the internal need to strive to become a kind and altruistic person, which can be found in some people today. As an increasing number of people become more ethically inclined and altruistic, this will impact at the societal and eventually global level. Martinus interprets historical cultural development as illustrative of this ethical evolution of humankind, which will eventually, he says, result in the creation of an international world state. Much of his work was written in the time of and after the Second World War, and he stresses that much strife and conflict is still to come, but eventually permanent world peace will be a reality. While the evolution of humankind and all other beings is deterministic in its overall structure, Martinus's metaphysics does allow for a limited but genuine free will of the individual. The overall frame of what an individual fundamentally wants, and thus what the individual can will, is determined by its evolutionary stage. But in terms of the details of everyday life, an actual free will is exercised. Any primary want of an individual slowly shifts between hunger and satiation for certain types of experiences. At the current stage, for example, most people no longer wish for war and glory, but instead for peace and prosperity. The ideal is the denial of selfish and egoistic behavior and the adoption of selflessness and altruistic acts. At the end of the entire cycle of evolution, after eons where the being has been through ever higher planes of existence, where no suffering and only altruistic love exists, it becomes satiated of even this blissful way of life and starts longing for the opposite, and a new cycle begins. So, viewed in the full perspective, the living being always achieves what it most profoundly wants throughout its eternal journey of life. Since experience as such is the manifestation of the interaction between oneself, or one's I, and other selves, everything one experiences is fundamentally dependent on oneself. Due to a specific organization of the fundamental structures of reality, positive or altruistic actions, or even thoughts, will result in positive experiences, that is, good life, while the opposite is true for acting in a harmful or selfish way, even when causing harm only indirectly, such as by eating animal products or not tending to the microorganisms that constitutes one's physical body. Thus, a metaphysical karmic causal mechanism is in effect, according to Martinus. It drives the evolution from selfishness toward selflessness, and thereby toward a happy and blissful life. Therefore, he says, even suffering and hardship are fundamentally positive. There's no true evil in the world, only the unpleasant good, as well as, of course, the pleasant good. And thus, he says, ultimately, everything is very good. As a side note, Martinus seems to have deliberately avoided public attention in his own lifetime, always pointing towards his work and not himself as that which was important. The biographies on him agree that he lived his own philosophy. He was, by all accounts, a modest, warm, and highly ethical person, not unlike Spinoza 3 centuries earlier. Various objections to Martinus's worldview can be proposed. First, Martinus's worldview is not a materialistic metaphysics and is, compared to this common and widespread position, vastly different in character. The assumption of metaphysical materialism being true can be substantially challenged, though, as I have discussed in other videos. Martinus's metaphysics can be characterized as a variant of, in a broad sense, absolute idealism, and a number of arguments support that position, as I have likewise discussed in an earlier video. In addition, Martinus's worldview generally does not appear to contradict the empirical observations grounding the theories of science. It only contradicts the materialist assumptions attached to these theories. Second, Martinus quite often uses religiously oriented language, and his worldview shares a number of similarities with esoteric Christianity and some New Age views. This may lead to a perception of it as a religious worldview. His usage of religious terminology can partly be attributed to his upbringing and lack of scholarly education, though. He had no academic education and was unfamiliar with the philosophical tradition and related terminology, and he invented terms for many of the elements in his metaphysics. A significant part of his terminology, it seems, he drew from the Sunday school he attended, common in the rural areas around the year 1900 when he was a child. At the same time, there are clear religious overtones in his work. Thus, he sees the presentation of his metaphysics and its metaphysically grounded, strongly ethical focus as a direct continuation of the ethical message of Christ, adapted to suit the people of today with their orientation toward rational arguments rather than faith or dogmatic belief. Likewise, God or the Godhead plays a very central role in Martinus's worldview, and the long-term aim for the individual is to achieve a personal relationship with the Godhead. On the other hand, he rejects many Christian dogmas and attributes them to human construction and misunderstanding, just as his concept of Godhead covers simply everything that exists. There's no creator separate from a work of creation, but instead the Godhead grounds and, in a certain sense, constitutes or is reality. Thus, the I of the individual living being is part of the I of the Godhead. So, in some sense, Martinus's Godhead equals what is termed the absolute in traditional philosophical absolute idealism. Third, Martinus claims that the basis of his metaphysical knowledge is transcendent or mystical experiences and insights. An epistemological basis like that is outside of what is usually to be found or accepted in the philosophical tradition, not least in an academic context. But precisely because of this specific epistemological basis, and since he clearly does not want to refer to some particular authority as the basis for justification, as is often seen in connection with religious dogmas, he chooses to persuade through rational arguments, that is, philosophically, in a broad sense. Further examination and discussion of his method and arguments will have to be left for another video, though. So, while each of these objections requires a more detailed treatment in order to be fully considered, it is clear that none of them can rule decisively against the project of considering Martinus's view core philosophical arguments. Martinus presents some novel views on the nature of reality, and it seems to be at least potentially fruitful to examine those in greater detail, perhaps alongside current philosophical positions that share elements with Martinus's metaphysical system. Given the difficult problems faced by contemporary philosophy, it seems worthwhile to at least take a closer look at alternative and yet untreated views on positions like Martinus's metaphysics, in the hope of progressing towards solutions to those problems. Notably, since Martinus's metaphysical system is one of absolute idealism, it avoids many of the traditional problems faced by other metaphysical positions. The materialist's problem of explaining consciousness on the basis of the physical, the substance dualist's problem of mental causation, and the subjective idealist's problem of objective grounding, for example. Even the traditional problem facing absolute idealism, the problem of the one and the many, in contemporary philosophy, this is known as the decombination problem of cosmopsychism, can arguably be handled by Martinus' metaphysics. I have made another video laying out the arguments for this in some detail. So, although a rather unconventional worldview, the metaphysical position of Martinus seems to avoid several large and very difficult problems plaguing contemporary philosophy. Okay, to sum up. Although Martinus can be categorized as a mystic in a fairly traditional sense, he stresses that the argumentative justification for his world picture, his metaphysical system, is not one of transcendent experiences, but instead one of rational arguments and logic. And he does indeed follow that methodological approach in his work. While there are significant religious overtones, not least connections to and interpretations of key aspects of Christianity, and his terminology borrows terms from that tradition, his works can be classified as being of broadly philosophical rather than religious character. His comprehensive metaphysical system is coherent and, in that sense, rationally based. Indeed, its coherent comprehensiveness is perhaps its greatest strength. It appears to deal with almost every significant phenomenon in human experience, explaining consciousness and the fundamental nature of reality, but also addressing topics such as personal ethics and the development of society. Key concepts in his metaphysics include the notion that fundamentally all of reality is one, the Godhead, but nevertheless the existence of individual subjects is upheld. And through a principle of reincarnation, these subjects are on an eternal journey toward ever new experiences. This journey is what life itself fundamentally is. Especially important for the human being is an existential focus on personal ethical development toward altruistic attitudes and behaviors based on wisdom and insight, the only path out of misery and suffering. Since the work of Martinus has received almost no attention when it comes to philosophical research, it is of interest to investigate his views further with the aim of providing fresh perspectives on difficult, unsolved problems within contemporary philosophy, such as the problem of consciousness. As his metaphysical system encompasses such a multitude of different topics, it could potentially provide interesting perspectives on other problems in philosophy as well. These might include theoretical problems, such as the question of free will, and practical ones, such as the prospects for an objective altruistic ethics, or the best way to ensure societal good and world peace. Thanks.